Welcome to Echoes of Holmes, where every shadow hides a secret. Tonight, Sherlock Holmes faces the masquerade of the Gilded Mask, where a vanished guest and a gilded mask conceal deadly truths. Pour yourself something warm, draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. The fog lay over London like a thick, grey shroud, swallowing the gaslit streets and leaving only dimly glowing lanterns to guide the occasional cab or hurried pedestrian. I had just returned from an evening of routine practice when a sharp rap at the door announced a visitor of some urgency. On opening, I found Inspector Lestrade, his usually composed demeanour uncharacteristically dishevelled, and behind him a young woman whose pallor suggested either fear or ill health, or perhaps a mixture of both. "Dr. Watson," Lestrade began, his voice tight, "you must come at once to Belgrave Terrace. It's unusual, and I believe Mr. Sherlock Holmes should see it." Holmes, who had been reclining with his violin and a pile of chemical reagents scattered about the table, raised one sharply arched eyebrow. "Unusual, you say, Lestrade," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Tell me, what category of London unusual do we have tonight? The most instructive cases are those which baffle the ordinary mind." Lestrade's face grew stern. "A woman has been found dead in her home, Dr. Watson. No sign of forced entry, nothing stolen." But her face hesitated. The words caught somewhere between horror and disbelief. Her face was hidden by a gilded mask. And yet there are marks of a struggle, as if she had been defending herself from someone she knew. Holmes's eyes glittered. He leaned forward with the intensity of a predator, his fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. Fascinating. A private residence, no forced entry, a gilded mask, and the suggestion of familiarity. "You have my attention, Lestrade. Watson, we depart immediately." The cab ride was suffused with an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional murmur from Lestrade, who attempted to recount the initial details. The victim was Lady Isidora Greville, a widow of some repute, known both for her beauty and her frequent appearances at the most extravagant social events in London. Her servants had found her body just after midnight, still dressed in the evening gown she had worn to a private gala, the mask upon her face gleaming with a mockery of the merriment she had surely enjoyed hours before. I watched Holmes as we approached Belgrave Terrace. He was unusually silent, his eyes narrowing, examining the passing streets, the flickering lamps, and even the patterns of the fog. At one moment he leaned slightly toward me and, with a casual wave of his gloved hand, remarked, "Watson, observe that lamplighter across the street. Note the irregularity in his gait, and yet the precision with which he adjusts the flame each time. A small detail, perhaps, but it is the tiny aberrations that often reveal the grandest truths." I noted his observation, though at the moment I could not see the connection. It was typical of Holmes to extract the extraordinary from the seemingly trivial. We arrived at the stately terrace, its red brick facade half obscured by curling mist. Servants flitted nervously in the shadows as we entered, guiding us to the drawing-room where Lady Greville's body had been temporarily laid out before removal to the coroner. The room smelled faintly of rosewater and smoke, an uneasy combination that seemed to echo the discord of the crime itself. There she lay, the golden mask reflecting the dim candlelight in fractured patterns. Her hands were clenched as if in a silent plea, and there were faint abrasions along her wrists and forearms, suggesting a desperate attempt at self-defense. Yet the room bore no signs of theft. The only other curious feature was a single card on the mantel, a small, black-edged note upon which was scrawled in exquisite handwriting, "Every mask reveals the truth it seeks to hide." Holmes bent to examine the note, his lips curling in a faint, amused smile. "Ah, the villain fancies themselves theatrical. Lestrade, my good man, you are dealing with someone who delights not merely in crime, but in the art of deception itself. And in that instant I realized that this was no ordinary murder. The stage was set for a game of wits that would test Holmes as never before with misdirection, secrets, and subtle clues hidden in plain sight. A masquerade, indeed, but of the deadliest variety. We returned to 221B Baker Street under a blanket of London fog that seemed to thicken with each passing hour. Holmes had been unusually quiet throughout the cab ride, his sharp eyes scanning the passing street lamps and the occasional late-night pedestrians with a concentration that made even Lestrade appear relaxed by comparison. For my part, I was deeply unsettled. Lady Isidora Greville's death, peculiar as it was, carried a weight of deliberate malice that made it difficult to dismiss as the random act of a criminal mind. Once inside our familiar quarters, Holmes settled into his high-backed chair, stretching one long leg across the other with the grace of a cat. He allowed his fingers to drape across the violin, resting at his side, though it was evident he did not intend to play. Instead, his sharp and penetrating eyes seemed to pierce the very walls of our flat, as if he were already reconstructing the events at Belgrave Terrace in his mind. "Watson," he began at last, without looking up from the half-empty inkwell on the table, "the affair of Lady Greville is, to ordinary observation, utterly confounding. A home with no signs of forced entry, a victim known to host the most secure of gatherings, and yet the perpetrator has chosen a theatrical mode of murder. The mask, the note, these are deliberate acts, symbols almost, and they indicate a mind which relishes both attention and misdirection." I nodded, though a shiver ran down my spine at the thought of such a calculating murderer. "It is curious, Holmes," I said, "that nothing of value appears to have been taken. It seems as if the motive lies not in theft or revenge, but something else entirely. Perhaps a message, or an elaborate warning." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his thin lips. "You are thinking in the right direction, Watson, though rather timidly. A message, yes, but not one intended for the general public. The careful selection of a masquerade, the preservation of the victim's attire, even the precise placement of the note, all point toward an intimate knowledge of her habits, her social connections, and her private fears. It is a murder designed not merely to kill, but to communicate and to mislead those who attempt to solve it." I took up my pen and began to record his observations, though I could not help but feel the familiar pang of frustration at my inability to see what he already knew. "You suggest, then, that the killer is someone close to Lady Greville? A friend, perhaps, or an acquaintance within her circle?" Holmes allowed a long pause, the kind that always suggested he was weighing not only the plausibility, but the elegance of his deductions. "Close proximity, certainly," he said, finally. "Yet one must not discount the possibility of a stranger exploiting that familiarity. In London, Watson, intimacy may be fabricated almost as easily as a lie. It is the inconsistencies, the minutiae overlooked, that reveal the truth. Take, for example, the lamplighter you observed with me outside Belgrave Terrace. A minor detail seemingly irrelevant, yet it may offer a key to understanding the murderer's method." I frowned. The lamplighter? Surely his presence is trivial. He was across the street, lighting lamps, doing no more than performing his duty. Holmes waved his hand dismissively, though the glint in his eye suggested he already knew I would not grasp the full significance. "Ah, Watson, the trivial is often the most telling. Observe his gait, his hesitation, the way he adjusts the flame at irregular intervals. These are not matters of chance. They indicate a mind trained in careful observation, a mind capable of subtle manipulation. and when one considers the position of the body, the alignment of the note, and the absence of any forced entry, one must entertain the notion that the murderer is both methodical and theatrical, placing emphasis upon what will mislead as much as upon the act itself. I noted his words carefully, though the complexity of his reasoning left me somewhat dizzy, yet the more I listened, the more I sensed that the case would demand not only intellect, but patience and a tolerance for subtlety far beyond the ordinary. Holmes stood abruptly and moved toward the fireplace, pulling a small, polished magnifying glass from the mantel. He inspected the note we had retrieved, turning it in the lamplight. "Observe the ink, Watson. A delicate mix, not standard for ordinary correspondence, suggesting the use of private materials, possibly imported, certainly chosen with care. The strokes of the pen, though fluid, betray a hesitation on the part of the writer at certain junctions. There is a meticulousness here, but one that is interspersed with anxiety. And anxiety," he added, tapping the paper, "is often the reflection of personal stakes, of knowledge we are not yet privy to." I glanced at him, fascinated despite my lingering unease. "So you believe the note itself provides a clue beyond mere theatrics?" Holmes allowed a thin smile. "Indeed, the note is a mask in its own right. It obscures as much as it reveals. One might dismiss it as dramatic flair, and yet it is, in truth, the first whisper of a more intricate design. And design, Watson, is always the companion of intelligence, though it is too often the friend of arrogance as well." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, a counterpoint to the tension that filled the room. I realized that Holmes was already envisioning the next steps, the scrutiny of servants, the mapping of social engagements, the minute examination of the house itself. Every detail would be significant, every shadow, every hesitation, every discarded glove or overturned chair could serve as a key to unlocking the murderer's identity. After a pause, Holmes moved toward the window, staring into the thickening fog. "It is clear that we are not dealing with a simple crime of passion or opportunity. There is planning here, Watson, and patience. The killer has orchestrated not merely the murder, but the narrative of the crime, manipulating the perceptions of those who would seek to unravel it. Scotland Yard, for all its efforts, will likely stumble upon false leads, becoming ensnared by what is most visible rather than what is most telling." Lestrade, who had lingered awkwardly by the door, shuffled forward at that moment. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I am at a loss. Every lead we follow seems to evaporate into nothing. It is as if Lady Greville vanished into thin air, and yet the body remains as proof of some grim reality." Holmes regarded him with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Precisely, Lestrade. And that, my dear Inspector, is why the truly observant mind is indispensable. Watson, you will accompany me to Belgrave Terrace again at first light. I wish to examine the servants personally, trace the movements of the household in the hours preceding the murder, and establish a temporal framework for the event. And, Lestrade," he added, his voice sharpening, "you will refrain from interference until such time as your presence becomes essential. Observation, patience, and discretion are the tools of a detective, not haste, not conjecture." Lestrade nodded, though the faint crease of frustration on his brow suggested he was unused to such instructions. I, however, could not help but admire the calm authority with which Holmes delineated our course of action. His mind was already several steps ahead, mapping invisible threads that connected the victim, the location, and inevitably the killer. As I sat by the fire, jotting notes and attempting to anticipate Holmes's next deduction, I felt a mixture of awe and trepidation. The case of Lady Greville was not merely a puzzle, it was a labyrinth, and one misstep could lead even the most careful investigator astray. And yet, with Holmes at the helm, I sensed that the labyrinth could be navigated if only one possessed the patience and acumen to follow where he led. Outside, the fog deepened, swallowing the gaslights in rolling waves of grey. Inside, the quiet tick of the clock and the soft scratch of pen on paper marked the beginning of a journey into a mystery that promised both danger and revelation. One thing was certain. The masquerade had only just begun, and the true game would reveal itself in shadows and secrets hidden well beyond the eye of ordinary men. The morning air was damp and heavy as we made our way through the twisting streets of Belgravia, the fog of the previous night having lifted only slightly to leave a thin, misty haze over the neighbourhood. Holmes walked with his usual swift, purposeful stride, his eyes darting from windows to doorways, noting angles and shadows that would escape any ordinary observer. I, struggling to keep pace, found myself reflecting on his earlier comments regarding the lamplighter and the subtle clues that often lay hidden in plain sight. Upon arrival at Belgrave Terrace, we were met by the same nervous servants who had discovered Lady Greville's body. Holmes allowed them only a brief nod before instructing Lestrade and me to stand aside while he began a meticulous examination of the scene, this time with his attention focused on details that might have been overlooked the night before. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, crouching near the fireplace, "the angle at which the body was found in relation to the room, the slightly disturbed placement of the chair, and the faint smudge along the carpet near the hearth. It is a trifling detail, you would say, but note that it aligns perfectly with the pattern of movement one would expect from a visitor attempting to restrain the occupant briefly, then flee without disturbance. The killer is clever, yet his precision has betrayed him in a subtle imperfection." I bent closer, examining the carpet as he indicated. Indeed, there was a faint indentation, as if the heel of a boot had pressed into the fibres, then shifted slightly toward the window. "A trail, perhaps?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head slightly, his expression one of amused patience. "Not a trail, Watson, but a signature. The criminal's haste, the careful yet imperfect placement of objects, each of these is a fingerprint of behavior, not of physical presence. Most men, confronted with such a scene, would see only chaos, and yet in chaos patterns emerge for the patient observer." His gaze then fell upon the mantel, where the black-edged note had been placed. Holmes picked it up and studied it intently, turning it in the soft morning light. The note is significant not only in its message but in its position. It has been laid with precision, deliberately angled to attract attention the moment the door is opened, and yet notice the tiny crease along its lower edge, an indication that it was previously folded, perhaps hidden within a pocket or a small compartment. I nodded, impressed despite myself. So the killer did not merely wish to send a message, but to ensure it was discovered in a particular manner. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "The intention is theatrical, yes, but also psychological. The murderer is confident, methodical, and, dare I say, enjoys the notion that others will be misled by appearances. And this, Watson, is why we must examine every person associated with the household, from the eldest servant to the most seemingly inconsequential visitor." We began our inquiries with the house staff, starting with the butler, a gaunt man named Mr. Penrose. His hands were knotted with veins, and his voice betrayed both deference and unease. He recounted the evening with meticulous care. Lady Greville had hosted a private gala, attended by a select circle of friends, patrons of the arts, and a few distant relatives. No strangers were present, according to the guest list, and all servants had been accounted for in their duties. Holmes listened silently, occasionally nodding and making brief notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "Were there any guests who lingered unusually long, or perhaps exhibited behaviour inconsistent with the evening's festivities?" he inquired, his tone gentle yet probing. Penrose hesitated. There was one gentleman, Mr. Cyril Harcourt, who seemed overly attentive to Lady Greville throughout the evening. He asked several questions about the estate and lingered near the side corridor where the private study is located. I did not think much of it at the time, as he was a distant cousin of a friend of Lady Greville's. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping lightly against the notebook. "A distant cousin, you say? And no one else lingered in that area?" "None that I recall, sir," Penrose replied, a bead of sweat glistening on his temple. Next we spoke with the housemaid, a timid young woman named Clara. Her hand shook as she recounted the events leading up to the discovery of Lady Greville's body. She mentioned that the victim had excused herself from the gathering shortly before midnight, claiming a headache. Clara recalled hearing muffled sounds, a struggle perhaps, though she could not place its source. By the time she approached the drawing room, the body had already been discovered. Holmes listened intently, occasionally glancing toward me as if to confirm that I was recording each word. "And the mask?" he asked softly. "Did you notice anyone handling or touching it before the body was found?" Clara shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. It was as though it had been placed there deliberately after she was attacked." Holmes nodded, his lips pressed together in contemplation. "Indeed, there is consistency in the placement, Watson. The mask is not a mere covering, it is part of the narrative, an embellishment designed to evoke fear, curiosity, or perhaps both. The killer understands the power of symbolism as keenly as any playwright or painter." I found myself shivering slightly at the thought. The deliberate artistry of murder combined with precise methodology was more unsettling than mere brutality. Holmes, perceiving my unease, allowed a faint smile. "Fear not, Watson. It is precisely this predictability of behavior within an unpredictably complex scenario that enables deduction. The criminal seeks to manipulate our perceptions. We shall simply turn the manipulation to our advantage." Our investigation continued throughout the morning, with Holmes examining the study, the corridors, and even the exterior windows for the faintest irregularities. He measured distances, noted the alignment of furniture, and tested surfaces for impressions that could betray the movement of a visitor. Finally, he returned to the drawing room and motioned me closer. "Watson, observe the abrasions on Lady Greville's wrists. They suggest a struggle, yes, but also the absence of defensive wounds elsewhere indicates that the assailant controlled the encounter with precision, ensuring minimal exposure to risk. Note also the faint trace of a powder, perhaps from a cosmetic or garment, along the hem of her gown. It is subtle, easily overlooked, yet it may prove significant when tracing the movements and interactions preceding her death." I leaned closer, scrutinizing the traces as Holmes indicated. The attention to detail was exhausting to follow, yet thrilling in its promise of revelation. "So the killer left clues in plain sight, yet ensured they were almost invisible to those untrained in observation?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Watson. Observation is the sieve through which truth must pass. Only the attentive mind perceives what is otherwise concealed. And this, my dear fellow, is why our next step is to reconstruct the movements of all guests and staff in precise chronological order. Every detail may prove vital, no matter how trivial it may appear." As we prepared to leave Belgrave Terrace, I realized with a mixture of admiration and apprehension that the early investigation had already revealed the complexity of the case. Each minor detail, each hesitation, each misplaced object seemed to form a lattice of evidence waiting to be interpreted. Holmes was poised at the center of this lattice, seeing patterns invisible to the ordinary eye, and I knew that the true nature of the crime was far more intricate than any of us had yet imagined. Outside, the London streets were beginning to bustle, with the ordinary morning crowd oblivious to the shadows and secrets lingering behind the doors of Belgrave Terrace. Holmes paused, his gaze lingering on the scene one final time. "We are at the threshold, Watson," he said softly. "The masquerade has begun in earnest, and the players are yet unaware that the game has commenced. Now begins the work of untangling the threads one by one until the truth, however cleverly concealed, is laid bare." The day after our meticulous survey of Belgrave Terrace, Holmes summoned me early to Baker Street. His movements were unusually brisk, a subtle tension underlying the usual elegance of his stride. The intensity in his eyes suggested that he had spent the intervening night reviewing the facts, constructing scenarios, and perhaps discarding them with the ruthless efficiency of a man accustomed to mastering chaos. "Watson," he said as I entered, "I have given considerable thought to the guests and the staff of Belgrave Terrace. It is time to examine the matter from another angle. Every criminal act, however theatrically executed, arises from some desire, whether avarice, revenge, jealousy, or pride. We must ascertain which motive aligns with opportunity and means." I settled into my chair, eager to follow his reasoning, yet aware that at any moment his deductions might leap over my understanding entirely. "And do you believe we have a primary suspect in mind, Holmes?" I inquired. Holmes allowed a thin smile to curl across his lips. "Not yet, my dear Watson. We are not constrained by ordinary reasoning. Our task is to consider all possibilities, and in doing so to expose the weaknesses of each. Let us begin with the visitors present at Lady Greville's gathering." He spread a small roster of names upon the table, compiled from the meticulous accounts of the house staff. Among them were distant cousins, art patrons, a few musicians, and one particularly noted gentleman, Cyril Harcourt. Holmes's fingers hovered above the name with a deliberate slowness, as if savouring the anticipation of revelation. "Harcourt," Holmes murmured, "was reported to linger near the private study, ask pointed questions about Lady Greville's estate, and generally behave with a curiosity bordering on obsession. A man of such attentiveness cannot escape our notice, Watson, yet there is more to observe the handwriting of the note, a fine, deliberate script. It is too elegant for a common hand, but it lacks the flourish of an artist trained in proper penmanship, a compromise, perhaps, between natural education and self-conscious effort." I peered at the note again, trying to discern what he suggested. "So you believe Harcourt may have written it?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "It is a possibility, though circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence often appears convincing to the untrained eye, and yet it can mislead the most diligent of investigators. This is why we must consider all aspects of his behaviour and the timelines involved." Later that morning, we visited Harcourt at his residence, a modest flat in Bloomsbury. He received us with the polished courtesy typical of the well-educated gentleman, though I noted a faint tension in his hands and a nervous shift of weight from foot to foot. Holmes greeted him with his characteristic bluntness. "Mr. Harcourt," he began, "we understand you attended Lady Greville's gathering on the night in question. You lingered near the study, did you not?" Harcourt's lips pressed together, his eyebrows knitting. "I simply wished to speak privately with Lady Greville regarding a matter of business. It was an urgent inquiry concerning an art acquisition. I meant no harm, I assure you." Holmes studied him, eyes narrowing. "A business matter, you say, yet you lingered after most guests had departed, and you had the opportunity to leave unnoticed?" "Yes," Harcourt admitted, his voice slightly wavering. "But I did not leave until the end of the evening, as the others did. I thought to ensure Lady Greville's comfort." Holmes nodded slowly, making a few notes in his pocket notebook. "You are aware, Mr. Harcourt, that one might interpret your presence near the study as suspicious, given the circumstances of Lady Greville's demise?" Harcourt paled, a flicker of indignation crossing his face. "Of course, but I had no cause to harm her. I respected her greatly." As we left Harcourt's flat, Holmes fell silent, his pace unusually brisk. Once we were several streets away, I dared to voice my thoughts. "Holmes, he seems nervous, yes, but there is nothing overtly incriminating in his words or manner. Are we to consider him our primary suspect?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly, though a faint smile lingered. "That, Watson, is precisely the point. The ordinary mind seizes upon what is visible and interprets it according to expectation. Harcourt is a convenient focal point figure whose proximity, behaviour, and mannerisms can easily be twisted into evidence of guilt. Yet something in his demeanour, the subtle consistency of his accounts, suggests that he is too obvious a target. Nature abhors simplicity, and murder most artful is seldom committed by the person whose presence is conspicuous." I frowned, perplexed. "Well, then we are being misled deliberately?" Holmes's eyes gleamed, not deliberately by Harcourt perhaps, but by the very construction of this crime. The mask, the note, the position of the body, all are designed to divert attention. The murderer wishes the eye to rest upon the obvious, while the true details are concealed in subtleties, the timing of arrivals, the sequence of movements, the brief interactions unnoticed by casual observers. These are the threads we must follow, Watson, lest we be trapped by our own assumptions. The remainder of the day was spent revisiting the statements of the household staff, correlating them with the accounts of the guests. Holmes asked penetrating questions that teased out the minutest inconsistencies, discrepancies in recollection, and tiny lapses in memory that would otherwise escape notice. By evening, we returned to Baker Street, exhausted yet invigorated by the progress of the investigation. Holmes settled into his chair, poring over the compiled notes with a frown that deepened as he studied the patterns of movement and timing. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "Harcourt is at best a decoy. All the evidence pointing toward him is consistent with deliberate misdirection. The true perpetrator, I suspect, is not among those most visible, but rather one whose subtle presence has escaped both our notice and that of Scotland Yard." I sank back in my chair, trying to comprehend the implications. Then we are still in the dark. How do we proceed when even the apparent suspect is misleading? Holmes's smile returned, faint but knowing. With patience, observation, and the careful examination of what has been overlooked, every detail we gather, every hesitation in a statement, every overlooked item in a room serves to illuminate the truth. The masquerade is in its early stages, Watson. The players have yet to reveal themselves fully, and it is our task to provoke them into exposing the hidden intentions behind this carefully orchestrated facade. As the evening deepened outside and the gaslights flickered in the London streets, I felt once more that familiar mixture of awe and unease. Holmes's brilliance illuminated paths invisible to ordinary men, yet the very complexity of the crime promised that the resolution would demand both subtlety and courage. I had little doubt that the next step in the investigation would bring us closer to the killer, though I could not yet foresee the twists and revelations that lay ahead. One thing, however, was certain: the masquerade had begun, and the true nature of Lady Greville's death remained carefully concealed behind layers of artifice, theatrics, and deliberate misdirection. The morning arrived grey and cold, the London fog persisting stubbornly in the narrow streets as though the city itself were conspiring to obscure the truth. Holmes, unusually impatient, had already begun pacing our sitting-room when I entered. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his eyes flicked toward the window at intervals as though he were measuring some unseen variable in the fog-shrouded streets outside. "Watson," he began without preamble, "I have determined that we must revisit Belgrave Terrace. not merely to corroborate our prior observations, but to examine a single detail overlooked by both the staff and Scotland Yard. It is an inconsistency subtle enough to be dismissed by ordinary inspection, yet glaring in its implications once recognized. I noted the intensity in his voice and felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. Holmes seldom allowed the word inconsistency to pass without weighty significance. "And what might this inconsistency be, Holmes?" I asked, striving for composure. Holmes did not reply immediately. Instead, he retrieved his coat and magnifying glass, muttering as he adjusted his scarf. "The mask," he said finally, with a tone that made my pulse quicken. "The very object that has so captivated the imaginations of the investigators. There is something unusual about something deliberate and deliberate alone, which reveals a truth hidden from casual observation. Upon arrival at Belgrave Terrace, we were greeted once more by the nervous servants. Holmes allowed them only cursory greetings before moving directly to the drawing-room. The golden mask rested on the table where it had been placed for the coroner's inspection, its polished surface catching the early morning light. Holmes knelt beside it, his magnifying glass tracing the contours of the gilding and the delicate ornamentation. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "the edges of the mask. Notice the slight indentation along the right cheek and the faint residue along the inner surface. These marks are consistent with the wearer having been forcibly restrained, yet they do not correspond with any abrasions upon Lady Greville's face. A discrepancy arises whether the mask was not affixed during the struggle or it was applied after the fact." I bent closer, trying to discern what he meant. "Applied after the fact? You mean the mask was placed post-mortem?" Holmes inclined his head, eyes gleaming. "Precisely. And this changes the entire narrative, Watson. The killer sought not only to murder, but to craft an illusion, creating a tableau for the unwitting observer. The mask is a symbol, yes, but also a deliberate distraction from the actual method of attack." He paused for a moment, glancing around the room, with an intensity that made even me pause in silence. "But there is more. Observe the faint scuff marks upon the polished floorboards near the west-facing window. They are subtle, easily overlooked, but they indicate a sequence of movements inconsistent with any account provided by the staff or the visiting guests. Someone approached from the window. Did you notice? The trajectory is oblique, suggesting concealment rather than confrontation. I examined the marks, a chill running down my spine. The realization of deliberate staging unsettled me. So the murderer entered through the window? But you said there was no forced entry. Holmes's thin lips pressed together. Not in the conventional sense. The window mechanism is intricate, often requiring a delicate manipulation to avoid disturbing the latch. A common intruder might have failed, but our murderer is methodical, practiced in such subtleties. The point, Watson, is not merely the entrance, but the deception. Every element in this room has been arranged to mislead investigators. As he spoke, I noticed him moving toward the fireplace, crouching low to examine the hearth. He produced a small mirror and angled it carefully, reflecting light onto the mantel. The residue on the note, he whispered, is not from ink alone. A fine powdered sandalwood, I believe, mixed with a trace of talcum. It is a subtle signal, Watson, indicative of deliberate handling by a person well versed in the methods of concealment and misdirection. This is no amateur. The perpetrator is cunning, educated, and precise. I felt a shiver at his words, both admiration and unease. "And you believe this will guide us to the killer?" Holmes stood, eyes alight with quiet triumph. "It is the beginning, Watson. The clue itself does not yet reveal the culprit, but it exposes the methodology. Once the technique is understood, the pattern emerges and the false leads unravel. Observe also the faint trace upon the windowsill, a fingerprint partially obscured, yet sufficient to suggest the application of gloves, followed by partial removal. The killer sought to obscure identity, yet in doing so revealed intention. For several minutes he moved systematically around the room, noting minor abrasions on the floor, slight displacements of furniture, and the residual powder along the edges of the note. Each observation seemed insignificant in isolation, yet in combination they formed a lattice of intent and planning. Holmes turned to me with a measured smile. "The secret lies in the contradictions, Watson. The mask suggests one narrative, the floorboards another. The residue upon the note indicates careful handling, while the placement of objects indicates deliberate misdirection. The ordinary mind, focused upon the dramatic, will overlook the subtle. It is precisely these subtleties that reveal the truth." I realized, as he continued, that his mind had already begun to reconstruct the event sequence. So the killer not only created a false narrative, but also manipulated the scene to implicate Harcourt or any other obvious suspect, I asked. Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. It is the very elegance of misdirection, Watson. By focusing attention upon what is visually striking the mask, the note, the struggle investigators are drawn away from the actual movements, the real entry, and the sequence of actions. Once the true pattern is perceived, the masquerade dissolves." We spent the remainder of the morning retracing the steps suggested by the subtle evidence. Holmes's focus never wavered. He measured distances, noted angles, and reconstructed movement with a precision that left me breathless. The servants and Lestrade watched, some in confusion, others with grudging admiration, as he assembled the invisible narrative. By noon, Holmes finally stepped back, surveying the room with satisfaction. "Watson, we have discovered the hidden clue the element deliberately overlooked to mislead others. From this point we can begin to unravel the true sequence of events and identify those whose behavior aligns not with theatricality, but with opportunity and method." As we departed Belgrave Terrace, I felt a renewed sense of anticipation. The secret clue, subtle yet pivotal, had illuminated a path through the maze of misdirection. I understood, perhaps more clearly than before, that Holmes's genius lay not in perceiving what was obvious, but in discerning what had been deliberately concealed, hidden in plain sight. The masquerade, it seemed, was far from over, but the first threads of truth had been revealed, and I knew that the unravelling of the crime would require both patience and relentless scrutiny. Holmes's mind was already several steps ahead, and I could only hope that my own observations and record-keeping would suffice to keep pace with the revelation that was to come. The days that followed the discovery of the secret clue were a tense mixture of observation, correspondence, and careful reflection. Holmes had secluded himself in his study for hours at a stretch, scribbling notes, consulting journals of criminal behaviour, and examining sketches of Belgrave Terrace and its environs. He spoke little to me except in measured statements or questions designed to provoke my own reasoning. The ordinary bustle of London seemed oblivious to the silent urgency that had taken hold of Baker Street. It was late in the afternoon when Lestrade arrived in an unusually agitated state, knocking with impatience at our door. His usual composure had been replaced by the flush of worry. "Holmes, Watson," he began breathlessly, "there's been another incident, another death, and I fear it is connected." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he rose from his chair with a swiftness that betrayed both irritation and curiosity. "Another death, you say? Pray, elaborate." Lestrade hurriedly recounted the details. A young governess employed by a neighbouring household, Miss Emily Fairchild, had been found unconscious in her rooms, her expression frozen in shock. Though not yet deceased, she had suffered a violent assault and was clinging to life in the care of a physician. The circumstances bore striking similarities to Lady Greville's murder: a mask, deliberate positioning, and a note, this time smaller, and scrawled hastily on a scrap of paper, "Observe closely, for what is hidden is the most telling." Holmes folded his arms, pacing the room. Curious indeed. The escalation is clear. The pattern is deliberate, Watson. The murderer now operates with increased boldness, testing our attentiveness and exploiting what we believe to be our observations. This second act is no mere copy, it is a challenge. I watched him closely. A challenge? You mean the killer is aware that Scotland Yard, or even ourselves, is on the trail? Holmes stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on the distant street beyond our window. Of course, only a mind confident in its ingenuity would continue in this manner. The pattern, the theatricality, the careful use of masks and notes indicate a criminal who thrives on misdirection and the psychological torment of those who pursue him. It is a dangerous escalation, Watson, for the killer grows bolder with each act. Lestrade, frowning, interjected, "We've questioned everyone at Belgrave Terrace, all the staff and the visitors. We found no one with motive sufficient to justify such a crime, and now we have this attack. How is it that the first victim and now this one are linked, and yet no connection appears on the surface?" Holmes nodded gravely. "The connection is not on the surface, Inspector. It lies beneath in patterns, timing, and subtle behaviours. This is why the study of the secret clue at Belgrave Terrace is crucial. One must examine not only what occurred, but how it was staged to mislead. It is a game of shadows, and we must learn to perceive the shadows themselves." We departed for Miss Fairchild's lodgings immediately, the streets of London grey and misted in the late afternoon drizzle. Upon arrival, the scene was disturbing. The young woman lay pale and trembling, her room in apparent disarray. A mask, similar in design to Lady Greville's, had been placed beside her, and the small note rested atop her bedside table. The similarity to the previous crime was undeniable. Holmes crouched beside her and gently lifted her hand to examine faint abrasions. "Notice, Watson, the positioning of the scratches. They indicate an attempt to ward off an assailant, yet the victim was overwhelmed swiftly. The attacker is both strong and deliberate, capable of subduing resistance while maintaining control over the scene's presentation." I observed the room carefully, noting minor details as Holmes had instructed me at Belgrave Terrace. The slight scuff near the door, the angle of the bed, the faint smudge on the windowsill. Each element seemed to echo the prior crime, yet with subtle variation, as though the killer wished to test our attention to detail. Holmes rose, eyes alight with a mixture of excitement and gravity. "Observe also, Watson, the manner in which the note was placed. It is smaller, hastier, yet the handwriting, though rushed, matches the flourishes observed in the first note. The murderer is revealing a pattern intentionally, perhaps to bait us into error or to assess our powers of observation. In this escalation lies a psychological play as well as a physical one." I felt the weight of his words. The stakes had indeed risen. The killer was no longer content to act in secrecy. The acts themselves were a performance intended to manipulate those investigating. I could feel the tension in the room, a palpable anticipation that seemed to hang between us and the young governess. Holmes, with deliberate care, examined the small windows, the slightly ajar wardrobe, and the floorboards near the doorway. "Note, Watson, how the scuff marks here suggest entry and retreat along a path intended to avoid detection by the main corridor. It is a careful choreography of movement, yet imperfect, revealing the methodology. Here, in the minor inconsistencies, lies the key to both attacks. He paused and fixed his gaze upon the note once more. The messages, subtle in tone, indicate intelligence and deliberate intent, yes, but also a need for recognition. This is not a mind content merely with the act it craves: attention, psychological dominance, and the thrill of misdirection. The killer is, without doubt, calculating the responses of those who pursue him. Every observation we make is anticipated, Watson, and yet each anticipation carries within it a vulnerability. I realized that Holmes's focus extended beyond the immediate scene. He was not merely analyzing the assault, he was reconstructing the psychological map of the assailant, anticipating moves, predicting errors, and aligning them with physical evidence. The interplay of intellect and observation was, as always, extraordinary. Lestrade, watching Holmes, finally voiced a concern that had been gnawing at me. "But, Holmes, if we cannot determine motive from the victims or the visitors, how can we hope to find the perpetrator before another attack occurs?" Holmes turned slowly, his expression grave, yet composed. "Motive, Inspector, is often a red herring when one deals with a mind trained in misdirection. The key is method, pattern, and the psychology behind the act. If we understand the method, we can predict the next step. If we understand the pattern, we can anticipate the target. And if we comprehend the psychology, we can lay a trap for the criminal to reveal himself." As we departed Miss Fairchild's lodgings, the fog thickened once more, wrapping London in a silent, suffocating cloak. Holmes walked with his habitual swift, precise stride, his mind clearly several steps ahead of our own. I could feel the tension in every movement, the inexorable pull of a case that had grown more complex, more dangerous, and more personal with each passing hour. I understood then, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, that the stakes had risen not merely in terms of danger to the victims, but in the intellectual complexity of the case. Holmes' mind was already racing ahead, reconstructing possibilities, weighing probabilities, and preparing for the next stage where observation, cunning, and patience would be tested to their utmost limits. The masquerade continued, and the players were now fully aware that the game was underway. Holmes, however, seemed undeterred, almost invigorated, as though the escalation of stakes was exactly the challenge he had been seeking. I, for one, could only follow in his wake, recording, observing, and striving to match, even in part, the brilliance that illuminated the path through this intricate web of deception. The morning following the second attack dawned overcast, with a thin drizzle softening the sharp edges of London's streets. Holmes had risen unusually early, and I found him in the sitting-room already immersed in papers, sketches, and the small collection of implements he favoured for examining minute evidence. There was a rare intensity about him, a certain gleam in his eye that suggested he had already conceived a plan. "Watson," he said abruptly, glancing up as I entered, "we have observed, analysed, and reconstructed. Now it is time to act. The criminal has escalated, confident in his ability to mislead and manipulate. He will continue only if he perceives the lack of consequence, the absence of a mind capable of anticipating his movements. We must construct a scenario that forces the hand of the perpetrator, leaving him no choice but to reveal himself." I sank into a chair, wary yet eager. "A trap, then?" Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Precisely, Watson, but not a trap of brute force or mere entrapment. We shall employ subtlety, the manipulation of expectation, and the strategic placement of observation points. In short, we shall turn the game against him, using his own theatrics and penchant for misdirection to secure his exposure." Over the next several hours, Holmes orchestrated his plan with the precision of a conductor. He requested that Lestrade provide a detailed schedule of the upper-class social gatherings that Lady Greville and her circle were known to attend. He instructed me to discreetly visit these venues, noting any individuals whose behaviour suggested prior knowledge of our investigation. Meanwhile, he prepared a series of correspondences to be leaked to the press, fictitious yet plausible clues designed to test the killer's response. Holmes then turned his attention to the next probable target. Watson. The pattern is becoming evident. Each victim has been selected not for wealth, notoriety, or social connection alone, but for proximity to observation and potential exposure. The next act will likely involve someone who, like Lady Greville and Miss Fairchild, interacts regularly with multiple social strata, whose movements are predictable yet whose environment is susceptible to manipulation. We arranged to visit the residence of Lady Margaret Hawthorne, a close friend of Lady Greville, known for her charitable work and frequent attendance at social functions. Holmes' plan required precision. He needed to observe the household, identify potential vulnerabilities, and subtly signal our presence without alarming the staff or the intended victim. Upon arrival, Holmes immediately began examining the exterior, the position of windows, the alignment of lampposts, the approach of side streets, and even the likely paths a visitor might take to gain entry unnoticed. "Observe Watson," he whispered, "the shadow cast by the corner of the wall. It provides concealment for a brief interval, enough for someone agile and deliberate to manipulate a window latch or leave a note, if they were so inclined. The killer will seek the cover of darkness or distraction. We must predict both." Inside the drawing room, Holmes instructed the staff to continue with their routine, as if our visit were ordinary. Meanwhile, he placed subtle markers, an overturned cushion here, a note left within, sight there, carefully crafting the illusion of oversight while observing responses. Each movement of the household members was noted, minor hesitations recorded, and any deviation from the expected routine catalogued with meticulous care. As evening approached, Holmes finally positioned himself and me strategically within the room, observing from concealed angles. Lestrade had agreed to maintain a discreet presence nearby, ready to intervene should the situation escalate dangerously. Hours passed in silence, punctuated only by Holmes' whispered observations. "Watson," he murmured finally, "noted the window nearest the street. Its latch is slightly misaligned, an indication that someone has handled it recently. Observe the shadows in the courtyard. A figure may attempt to utilize this slight imperfection to gain access, believing it unnoticed." I strained my eyes in the dim lamplight, attempting to perceive what Holmes already anticipated. Soon, a slender silhouette emerged from the shadows, moving with cautious deliberation toward the window. The figure hesitated, adjusting gloves and attempting the latcher minor, almost imperceptible movement that Holmes had predicted with uncanny accuracy. "Now, Watson," he whispered, observing the behavior. The individual believes he is unobserved. Every gesture, every glance betrays intent. We do not need to intervene immediately. We merely watch and note, allowing the pattern of his actions to expose the character and methodology of the criminal. The intruder's movements were deliberate, yet anxious, betraying both confidence and caution. Holmes's eyes followed every motion, a faint smile playing at his lips. Notice the handling of the mask in his pocket, the slight adjustment of the coat collar to conceal residue on the sleeves. He mimics control, but the imperfections, the hesitations, the slight overcorrections reveal a mind constrained by caution, yet eager for recognition. I marveled silently at the clarity with which Holmes interpreted every gesture. To any ordinary observer, the figure's actions would have seemed insignificant, perhaps even accidental. Yet Holmes had anticipated them in advance, reading intention from the subtlest signs. After several tense minutes, the figure abandoned the window, retreating back into the shadowed alley. Holmes rose, walking with deliberate calm toward the entrance. "Watson, what we have observed is instructive. The perpetrator is cautious, meticulous, and highly intelligent. He is aware that his previous actions have been scrutinized, yet he continues, compelled by the desire to maintain control over perception. Our task now is to anticipate the next attempt, to predict the selection of the victim and the method of approach. From observation alone, patterns emerge, and from patterns, opportunity for intervention. We returned to Baker Street under the quiet drizzle, the streets of London reflecting the gaslight in shimmering silver ribbons. Holmes was unusually animated, pacing the room and elaborating upon the observed details, connecting every minor gesture to a broader pattern. "Watson," he said at last, with a rare note of satisfaction, "we have forced the criminal to act, to reveal his methods, without realizing the scrutiny under which he operates. The trap is not yet sprung, but the prey has made a misstep. All that remains is to anticipate the moment when the observation intersects with opportunity, and the true character of the perpetrator will be revealed." I sank into my chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of awe and apprehension. Holmes's brilliance lay not merely in deduction, but in the orchestration of circumstances, in the construction of a scenario that manipulated the criminal into exposing himself. The stakes had risen higher than ever, yet Holmes's mind seemed to thrive in the tension, poised for the next maneuver in a game of intellect and observation that promised revelation and danger in equal measure. The masquerade had entered its critical phase, and I understood that the real test of skill was about to commence, not in the discovery of a clue, but in the orchestration of events that would compel the true culprit to reveal the carefully concealed truth. The following evening, the tension in Baker Street was palpable. Holmes had spent the day reviewing every observation, every misstep of the perpetrator, and the subtle interactions of those connected to Belgrave Terrace and its surrounding households. He paced with unusual energy, pausing occasionally to scribble notes, adjust the sketches of windows and floorboards, or peer out at the fog-laden streets with a sharp, assessing gaze. "Watson," he said finally, breaking the silence, "tonight the culmination of our work begins. We have observed, reconstructed, and manipulated. The killer believes himself unobserved, yet he has already revealed his methods, his preferences, and most crucially, his psychology. It is now time to draw him out, to illuminate the truth behind the mask of deception. Our target, as Holmes had determined, was the private gallery of Sir Reginald Cartwright, a collector and acquaintance of Lady Greville. Sir Reginald was hosting a small gathering to display new acquisitions, and Holmes had arranged for our discreet presence, along with Lestrade nearby in a position of observation. The gallery was dimly lit, the shadows carefully orchestrated by Holmes to both conceal and reveal as needed. Guests mingled, oblivious to the quiet tension that underlay the room, while Holmes positioned himself near a corner, his eyes scanning every movement with clinical precision. "Observe, Watson," he whispered the posture, gestures, and gaze of each guest. "The perpetrator's habits, honed through prior acts, will betray him in subtle ways. The brief attention to corners, the minor corrections of clothing, the fleeting glance toward potential observers. The smallest deviation from expected behavior can illuminate character, and with it, culpability." Minutes passed in careful silence, each of us maintaining a posture of casual disinterest, while Holmes's mind raced. Then a man entered quietly through a side corridor figure that moved, with deliberate caution, adjusting a mask tucked beneath his coat, pausing slightly as if calculating the positions of other guests. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I felt the familiar thrill of recognition at his intensity. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the motions of that individual. He believes himself unnoticed, yet his actions echo the prior crimes, careful handling of a mask, subtle concealment of residue, and hesitations in movement that betray psychological tension. We are observing not merely behavior, but the mind at work, constrained by knowledge of scrutiny, yet compelled to repeat prior patterns." I followed his gaze, noting the man's careful steps, the nervous adjustment of his gloves, the slight hesitation at each corner. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet to Holmes these minor gestures confirmed every prediction he had made. Holmes gestured discreetly, and Lestrade advanced under the guise of an ordinary guest, positioning himself near the suspect without alarming him. The man, evidently aware that the room might be under observation, hesitated, glanced quickly at the exits, and adjusted the mask in his pocket once more. Holmes leaned closer to me, his voice barely audible. "Now, Watson, we set the final stage. The killer believes he is acting with impunity. Observe his next move, for it will reveal both intent and identity." The man approached the display case, seemingly intent on examining a minor sculpture. His attention, however, flickered repeatedly toward a small, deliberately placed card that Holmes had arranged, a card designed to lure and distract. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "There, Watson!" Observe the overcorrection, the sudden adjustment of hands and mask. That single, involuntary gesture exposes him. We have him through anticipation, observation, and manipulation. Now, Lestrade, approach with care. Lestrade moved swiftly, subtly but firmly, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. The individual froze, startled, and then attempted to flee. Holmes and I followed, intercepting him near the corridor. In a quiet yet commanding tone, Holmes addressed the man. "Your method was clever, your theatrics precise, but you underestimated observation and subtle prediction. The masks, the notes, the staging, all have led us here. You are Cyril Harcourt, are you not?" The man's eyes widened in shock, and for a brief instant his carefully constructed composure faltered. "I do not understand," he stammered. Holmes's expression was a mixture of sternness and intellectual triumph. "You have relied upon misdirection, theatrics, and the predictable psychology of your victims. You assumed that the obvious suspect would be overlooked in favor of the spectacle, yet you failed to consider that subtlety itself can be observed. Every hesitation, every correction, every adjustment of gloves and mask betrayed your intent and your method. The masquerade ends tonight." Harcourt's composure broke completely, and under the combined scrutiny of Holmes and Lestrade, he confessed reluctantly but fully. Each act, from the careful placement of Lady Greville's mask to the assault on Miss Fairchild, was meticulously recounted. He had sought to satisfy a perverse combination of intellectual challenge and psychological dominance, targeting those whose patterns he had observed and whose behaviors he believed predictable. Holmes listened with his customary calm, making occasional notes and glances toward the subtle details that corroborated his deductions, the scuff marks, the powder residue, the placement of notes. Finally, he addressed us both. "Observe, Watson," he said with a faint smile, "how the combination of method, psychology, and deliberate misdirection can construct an illusion of complexity. The killer relied upon assumptions of observation, yet these assumptions became his undoing. Every gesture, every minor imperfection ultimately revealed the truth to those who watched with patience and precision." As Harcourt was escorted away by Lestrade, Holmes turned to me with a rare note of satisfaction. "The masquerade is concluded, Watson, and the players revealed. What seemed inscrutable has, in fact, been transparent to the patient and observant mind. The true art lies not in the violence, but in the manipulation, the orchestration, and the careful exposure of one's own methods without realizing it. In that lies the greatest irony of criminal endeavor." I felt a mixture of relief and admiration, the culmination of days of tension finally resolved. The intricate web of deception, misdirection, and subtle clues had been unraveled, and the mind behind the crimes laid bare. Yet, as always with Holmes, the brilliance of deduction lay not merely in the revelation itself, but in the intellectual journey required to reach it. each step meticulously reasoned, each observation crucial to the ultimate truth. The arrest of Cyril Harcourt sent ripples through London society, yet within the confines of Baker Street, the aftermath was marked less by public attention than by a contemplative silence. Holmes, having dictated the particulars of the investigation to Lestrade and ensured the proper cataloguing of evidence, moved with a rare serenity, his mind already shifting toward the next mystery, even as the details of this one remained vivid in every gesture and observation he made. I, for my part, attempted to reconcile the events of the past week with the clarity of resolution. Harcourt's meticulous planning, his reliance on misdirection, and his psychological manipulation had created a maze of deception that had required all of Holmes's faculties to navigate. And yet, now that the truth had been revealed, the enormity of his methodical cruelty settled heavily upon me. We began the day with a visit to Lady Greville's residence, where the household had been plunged into a sombre routine. Servants moved quietly, their expressions a mixture of relief and residual fear. Holmes spoke briefly with Mr. Penrose, the butler, and Clara, the housemaid, offering reassurance, while delicately inquiring whether the household had noted any residual evidence that might illuminate minor details. Both servants were profoundly affected by the events, yet they spoke with precision and care, their testimony corroborating the observations we had already made. Holmes examined the drawing room, moving with deliberate care to avoid disturbing any lingering traces. "Observe, Watson," he said softly, "how the environment itself bears witness to the mind behind the crime. Even in the absence of the perpetrator, the patterns persist: the placement of furniture, the faint abrasions, the subtle residues. A clever criminal leaves not only evidence of action, but a psychological signature, which, if interpreted correctly, becomes a testament to the intelligence and caution that guided the crime." I observed the room, noting with renewed appreciation the subtle indications that had initially eluded both Lestrade and myself: the slight discoloration along the floorboards, the minute residue along the windowsill, and the precise placement of the note. All of these details, minor in isolation, had formed the lattice upon which Holmes had reconstructed the events with such precision. Later, we visited Miss Emily Fairchild, who was recovering under careful medical supervision. She greeted us with a fragile smile, her strength slowly returning. Holmes spoke to her gently, eliciting confirmation of small observations: the position of objects in her room, the timing of events, and the gestures of her assailant. Each piece of information served to reinforce the deductions already made and to close the final gaps in the sequence of events. As we left the infirmary, Holmes paused to speak to me privately. "Watson, one must appreciate the significance of control in these matters. Harcourt believed himself to be orchestrating every observation, every perception, yet he failed to account for the observer's patience and subtlety. The art of deduction lies not merely in noticing what is apparent, but in interpreting what is deliberately concealed. Even the most brilliant criminal can be undone by the very habits that define his methodology." I nodded, struck by the elegance of his reasoning. "So it is not mere intellect that exposes such a mind, but the combination of intellect, patience, and precise observation." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Exactly, Watson. The mind of the criminal in its confidence often produces patterns that are invisible to the inattentive, but to the trained eye, each hesitation, each correction, each moment of psychological tension becomes a key to the unraveling of the entire sequence. The masquerade, in the end, is exposed by the consistency of subtle deviations from perfection. That evening, we convened once more at Baker Street, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. Holmes sat in his high-backed chair, fingers steepled, while I recorded the final reflections of the case. It is remarkable, I observed, that such intricate planning could be brought undone not through brute force, but through the meticulous observation of subtle human tendencies. Holmes inclined his head, a faint smile playing upon his lips. Indeed, Watson, the true power of deduction lies in perceiving the invisible threads connecting action, intention, and environment. Harcourt's ingenuity was considerable, yet it faltered because it could not escape the laws of behavior, the inevitability of minor imperfection, and the insight of a mind trained to perceive the inconspicuous. Lestrade, who had returned briefly to report on the final arrangements for Harcourt's imprisonment, nodded in agreement. "It is humbling, Holmes," he said, "to witness the unravelling of such a careful deception. The man relied upon precision, yet it was precisely your own precision that exposed him." Holmes waved a hand, dismissively, his attention already shifting to other matters. "Do not overstate the drama, Lestrade. The role of observation is vital, yes, but it is only the instrument. The real work lies in reasoning from what is seen, deducing from subtleties, and anticipating the logical consequences of actions. The criminal, in orchestrating his events, has unwittingly provided the very framework for his own exposure. As I reflected on the case, I realized that the aftermath was not merely a matter of justice, but of understanding. The intellectual satisfaction of seeing patterns emerge from complexity, of witnessing human behavior illuminate both method and motive, was matched by a profound awareness of the precarious balance between observation and misdirection. Holmes, noticing my contemplative mood, remarked with a faint glint of amusement, "Watson, the satisfaction of resolution is not merely in apprehension, but in comprehension. We have observed, we have deduced, and the masquerade is concluded. Yet the lessons linger. No method is perfect, no deception beyond scrutiny, and no mind, however brilliant, can entirely escape the consequences of its own design." I felt a quiet admiration for Holmes's relentless pursuit of truth, his unerring focus on subtleties, and his ability to reconstruct events with such clarity. The city outside continued its ordinary rhythm, oblivious to the recent dangers and revelations. Yet within Baker Street, a sense of resolution prevailed. The masquerade had ended, the criminal brought to justice, and the intricate web of misdirection had been unravelled by intellect and patience. As night fell over the city, I could not help but marvel at the unique combination of brilliance, foresight, and human insight that had guided us through the perilous labyrinth of the case. The lessons of observation, deduction, and the careful interpretation of subtleties would remain with me, a testament to the unparalleled genius of Sherlock Holmes. The streets of London lay shrouded in a misty pall as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street after the final arrangements for Cyril Harcourt's imprisonment had been made. The city moved with its usual unobservant rhythm, oblivious to the intricate drama that had unfolded in its quieter quarters. Yet within the walls of 221B, the atmosphere was charged with a subdued triumph, tempered by reflection and the lingering shadow of human folly. Holmes moved to his familiar chair, leaning back with a rare expression of serenity. The case had concluded, the masquerade unveiled, and the intricate web of deception dismantled by observation, deduction, and patient orchestration. And yet his mind seemed already engaged with distant problems, invisible to the casual observer, as if the act of resolution merely opened the door to the next challenge. "Watson," he began, his tone calm yet penetrating, "it is a curious phenomenon, is it not, how the human mind, when guided by intellect and calculation, can produce both marvel and horror? Harcourt's ingenuity was considerable, yet it was inevitably constrained by the limitations of psychology and method. In striving to orchestrate perfection, he left behind the minutest imperfections the threads we traced, to unravel the entire affair. I nodded, reflecting upon the long days and nights we had spent examining every detail, reconstructing each movement, and interpreting every hesitation. "It is remarkable," I replied, "how subtlety and observation alone were sufficient to expose him. One might assume that a criminal of his intelligence would elude even the most acute scrutiny." Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Ah, but that is the eternal paradox, Watson. Intelligence alone is insufficient. It is the predictable patterns, the unconscious gestures, the minor deviations from perfection that betray intention. The criminal relies upon perception, yet in constructing a narrative for others, he inevitably leaves a signature, however invisible it may seem. This signature is the very key that allows deduction to operate. We spoke at length of the victims of Lady Greville and Miss Fairchild, and of the household staff whose quiet courage had contributed to our understanding of the events. Holmes emphasized the importance of observation and patience, of noting what is readily apparent and what is deliberately concealed. He recounted with subtle satisfaction the precise moments when Harcourt's actions betrayed his intent, how the minor hesitation in a gesture or the misalignment of a mask became critical evidence. I could not help but marvel at the elegance of his reasoning, the effortless blending of intellect and insight, of psychology and subtle observation. The truth, which had seemed so obscured by theatricality and misdirection, had been revealed not by force or intuition, but by careful reconstruction and the patient pursuit of pattern and method. Lestrade visited later that afternoon to report on the smooth transfer of Harcourt to the authorities. He spoke with characteristic bluntness, acknowledging Holmes's unparalleled skill. "I confess," he said, "that were it not for your insights, Holmes, I would have been confused by this case indefinitely." The man's cleverness seemed insurmountable. Holmes waved a hand modestly, though the faint glint in his eyes betrayed the satisfaction of victory. "It is not cleverness, Lestrade, but consistency in imperfection that ensures exposure. One may weave a web intricate and artful, yet the thread of human fallibility inevitably emerges. Observation and deduction merely illuminate what already exists hidden in plain sight." Later that evening I reflected quietly in the sitting-room, pen in hand, recording the events of the case with all the clarity I could muster. Holmes moved about the room with measured purpose, occasionally glancing toward the window at the fog-laden streets. He seemed at once satisfied and restless, a duality I had come to recognize as characteristic of his brilliant mind. "Watson," he said softly, joining me by the fire, "it is often remarked that criminality is unpredictable, that human action defies anticipation. Yet the truth is rather simpler behavior, however artful, follows patterns. Those patterns may be subtle, hidden beneath layers of misdirection, yet they remain decipherable to the attentive mind. Our task, as observers and interpreters, is to perceive the invisible threads and reconstruct the intentions that guide them." I glanced up, impressed by the simplicity of the principle amidst the complexity of its application. "And the masquerade itself, Holmes? It is over?" Holmes allowed a faint smile to curl at the corners of his lips. "For now, Watson, the masquerade is never truly over. Life presents endless variations upon a theme, each with its own intricacies, misdirections, and revelations. But in this case the game is concluded and the players exposed. The mask has fallen, the notes have been read, and the sequence of events laid bare for those with the patience and acuity to perceive it." As the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the familiar walls, I felt a sense of completion, tempered by admiration and reflection. The resolution of the case was not merely a matter of justice, but a testament to the power of intellect, observation, and human insight. It was a reminder that the most brilliant designs, no matter how carefully orchestrated, are subject to the subtle inconsistencies that define human action. Holmes rose once more, moving toward his window. "Watson," he said quietly, "our work is never done. London is full of mysteries, some trivial, some perilous, yet all offering the opportunity for observation and reasoning. Each case is a masquerade of its own design, with layers of artifice and truth. We are merely the interpreters, seeking to unravel the patterns beneath the surface." I recorded his words with solemn admiration, aware that they reflected both the conclusion of this particular case and the enduring philosophy of a mind unparalleled in its acuity. The city outside remained fog-laden and mysterious, yet within Baker Street a quiet sense of accomplishment prevailed. The masquerade had ended, but the lessons it provided of observation, deduction, and the delicate interplay of psychology and evidence would remain indelibly with me. As night deepened over London, I set down my pen, glancing across the room at Holmes, who now seemed absorbed in distant thought. The case of the masquerade of the Gilded Mask had drawn to its close, yet the brilliance, foresight, and subtlety of Sherlock Holmes would continue to illuminate every shadow, reveal every concealed intention, and challenge every observer to see beyond the surface of things. And so the city slept, unaware that its mysteries had been laid bare, and that the mind of Sherlock Holmes had once more brought order, clarity, and justice to the hidden patterns of human intrigue.